If you feel like an imposter when it comes to your professional personal brand, then consider how you can use identity shifting to overcome your imposter syndrome. Grab your cup of tea and let's dive into it. Imposter syndrome is this psychological concept about feeling like you aren't as capable as other people perceive you to be. It can lead to feelings of feeling like you're a fraud, of being found out, of fear of failure. It can lead to feelings of overwork and burnout as a result of having this imposter syndrome. For people that feel like they have imposter syndrome, like a lot of my personal brand coaching clients express to me, I understand that this can be a very real feeling. But I also feel like a lot of the conversation, especially on the internet, is around the feeling of having imposter syndrome as opposed to how you can actually overcome it. And in my humble opinion, as a personal brand coach, not as a psychologist, one of the most interesting ways that you can do that is through this idea of identity shifting. So what is identity shifting? It's a concept about consciously shifting your personal identity. So this is about aligning your thoughts, your beliefs, your actions to your desired self. So who is it that you want to be? Do you want to be a more confident person? Do you want to be a healthier person? Do you want to be a more successful person? It is about aligning your thoughts and your actions towards that thing, as opposed to where your current self-concept may be. It really brings together the best of psychology, neuroscience, and personal growth together to rewire your mind and your life. And I know that a lot of people, when they hear an idea of this, might start criticizing this concept and talking about the value of authenticity in personal branding. And I do think that there is value in authenticity in personal branding. Authenticity in personal branding is the reason why a certain personality can jump off the screen and connect with you, or the reason why you feel a connection to a person based on the words that you read in a book. Personality is what makes you authentic, but I often think that this overuse of authenticity in personal branding can also sometimes just become an excuse. It can become an excuse to stay in your comfort zone, as opposed to testing some of your limiting beliefs about yourself and discovering what might actually be on the other side of your comfort zone, which isn't actually you being inauthentic, but you actually fulfilling your true potential. You actually discovering all of the things that you're capable of doing if you didn't actually have those limiting beliefs about yourself. So while things might initially not feel authentic, they may when you actually develop the thoughts, the beliefs, and the actions that align with what that potential desired self could be. It is this elevated version of what your current self-concept is. And for me, this also comes back to the idea of a fixed mindset versus a growth mindset. Because a fixed mindset is where you believe in natural born talent, for example, where you believe that you are a product of your environment and that you aren't actually controlling that necessarily. A fixed mindset is what keeps you in your comfort zone, whereas a growth mindset is where you believe that you can potentially develop new skills and new talents, and it's not just about your natural born gifts and personality, and that you can actually achieve beyond those things. You can adapt to your environment, you can change, you can grow. And this is where I feel that there is this difference between imposter syndrome, which for me sits in this fixed mindset that you are a product of your environment and that you didn't actually earn your position there, it just sort of happened to you, as opposed to a growth mindset, where you do take control of your actions and your circumstances, and you believe that if you are in a particular position, whether that is positive or negative, that you contributed to being in that position. So if you do have a wonderful job and you're feeling like you have imposter syndrome, it's about reminding yourself that it was your actions and your behaviors that actually led you to earn that position. And if you potentially do feel like you have limiting beliefs when it comes to what you are capable of for your personal brand, your professional personal brand, and that desired self that you may want to shift your identity to. There is a concept in neurolinguistics programming that has always resonated with me, and it is this idea that limiting beliefs are actually limiting decisions. The decision preceded you having that limiting belief. When you change that mind frame around your limiting beliefs actually being limiting decisions, you again are able to take control of that feeling and understand that you made that choice to have that limiting belief, and you can then also make the decision to not have that limiting belief. For me, this also comes back to the law of assumption, which is essentially that our inner state creates our outer reality. So if we feel like we are an imposter, then to me this is potentially an opportunity to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we tell ourselves that we are an imposter, then all of those things related to imposter syndrome may actually eventuate, because that is how we feel about ourselves. So instead of feeling like an imposter, how do we change our identity to actually shift to that more confident version of ourselves, to feel like we deserve what we have achieved in our career, or that the professional personal brand that we are creating is actually aligned with us authentically. It's just an elevated version of us. So let's get into the tips for how you can move from imposter syndrome to identity shifting. And tip number 1 is to write down your identity shift goals. I've spoken a lot about writing down your goals on this channel recently, and that is because the science tells us that this will help to set you up for success. There was a study at Harvard University that showed that the people who wrote down their goals, as opposed to the people who simply thought about them or didn't actually write them down at all or have any goals, were able to earn 10 times more than what their counterparts did 10 years later. So what is that identity shift that you want your future self to have? Where do you see yourself? Do you see yourself as being a CEO, for example? Do you see yourself as being a successful business owner? What is it that that person actually looks like? How do they behave? What are their actions? What are their thoughts? What does their day-to-day look like? By having a stronger understanding of how you are able to picture what that identity is, you're able to establish more of an emotional connection to that thing, so that you can start to shift your own thoughts and behaviors towards what that desired self is. This isn't about being inauthentic, but it's rather about focusing on what is aspirational. Tip number 2 is to chart the path for your identity shift. In his book, The Talent Code, Daniel Cole argues that talent isn't born, it's created. So when you think about that identity that you want to have, and you start to have a stronger understanding of what that person looks like, what their day looks like, what their behaviors look like, how are you actually charting the path to become that person? For example, if you do want to be a CEO, then what does a CEO's daily habits on average look like? There was research that was published that said that the average CEO reads 60 books a year. So if this is a habit that the majority of CEOs have, then how can you build a habit like this or an equivalent habit into your routine? So you don't have to be a CEO yet, but you are starting to develop the habits that that CEO that you desire to be would have. And if you follow this channel, you know I am a huge fan of focusing on the habits and routines that actually underpin who you are as a professional personal brand, because they matter more than you might actually think. There is a concept that Michael Hyatt talks about in his book, Free to Focus, where he talks about the 3 stages that we all have. He says we have a front stage, which is the work that people usually see. But then we have a backstage, which is the work that goes into us being able to show up on that front stage. It's the backstage that sometimes people don't see as much of. But then an area that often doesn't get as much attention is our offstage. So these are the things that are seemingly unrelated to our work, but allow us to be able to show up on those other 2 stages. So for a CEO, for example, maybe it is all of that reading that they do in their personal downtime that contributes to them being able to perform in their job. So when it comes to that identity shift and that desired self-concept that you have, what are those little things that are going to help you to become that person that you can potentially start now that will allow you to start to build those pathways or those neurological pathways to actually become that person, where it can then feel less like you're an imposter when you arrive at that thing and more like you have actually created the skills, the talent, the life to actually support that person that you know that you have the potential to be. My tip number 3 for your identity shift is to add visualization to your reinvention. I've talked a lot on this channel recently about the power of visualization because I feel like it is a really under-discussed topic when it comes to professional development. And yet it is what the top performers in the world understand well. This is what athletes do, what the best salespeople do, what the best singers and performers do. They mentally rehearse before they actually go out and do that thing, before they actually achieve their goal. They're creating the neural pathways that will allow them to achieve that thing. If you start to feel like the idea of visualization is potentially too far-fetched for you and you're more accustomed to the traditional professional way of writing everything down and creating plans, which, as we've talked about a lot on this channel, has a lot of benefit, try and remind yourself that while those things are important, visualization is what humans have been hardwired for longer than those things. The idea of language, reading, and writing in the big scheme of human history is a relatively new acquisition for us. We have a hardwired predisposition for interpreting visuals around us. So by adding visualization to your identity shift, you are strengthening the ability for you to have that emotional connection to your identity shift. You're telling your subconscious what it is that you want to achieve in that space. So for me, using something like Pinterest is a way to really get granular on what my visualizations for my future self are. I use that as an opportunity to break down the annual vision board that I create into more specific details. I create different boards related to different things on Pinterest, and I create subboards within those things as well. So when you think about the visualization that you have for yourself and your future personal brand, your professional brand, then what is it that you can actually capture on Pinterest to really start to get your subconscious to be able to focus in on that thing? So how does that person dress? What do they eat? What do they drink? What are their hobbies? Create visualizations that very specifically relate to those things so you can start to train your brain to associate with those things. Tip number 4 is to pinpoint a launch date for your reinvention. This is something that I have talked about a little bit on this channel recently because it was an idea that resonated with me when I read Dan Pink's book, When, and he talks about this idea of temporal landmarks. And as humans, we use physical landmarks, as we know, to navigate space, but we also use temporal landmarks to navigate time. This is the reason why we feel a certain way on the 1st of January or the 1st of a month as opposed to the rest of the year. But as Pink proposes in When, he talks about the opportunity that we have to create temporal landmarks throughout the year. For example, my husband and I are going to be moving into a new home soon, and it's given me an opportunity to think about the person that I want to be in that next chapter of my life and the person that I don't want to be. It's given me a milestone or a deadline in a way to be able to start to work towards that thing. So when you think about your own life, what are the milestones that you can potentially use as just a little deadline for you to actually start to make moves on those things? So you're not just visualizing, you're not just writing down your goals, but you're actually putting things into place. You're starting to actually make moves. Now you might be potentially moving city, maybe you're moving away from home, maybe you're moving back home, maybe you're also moving home in general to another location. But if you're not moving, there's also plenty of opportunities to think about how this concept could apply as well. You might, for example, have a work anniversary coming up. Maybe you can use your birthday. Maybe you could use the birthday of someone that you're close to. You might use the start of a particular sort of season that you have relating to your work. Maybe it could be the start of a new relationship for you. Maybe it could be the end of a relationship. It could even be just simply the next 1st of the month, or even just the next Monday that you decide that you want to start making moves towards being that person. And what this idea reminds me of is almost that moment in movies where that character has that little transformation, magic makeover moment in the story, and they reveal this new version of themselves. And often all this is really just a bit of a more dramatic way for that person to be able to bring out the confidence that was already within them. All of those characteristics usually already existed in that person. They just needed a moment to be able to break down some of those limiting beliefs. They needed just those little surface level changes to be able to start to step into that new identity. So when it comes to your own professional personal brand, what are the little things that you can do at a particular point in time that is going to help you to feel like you have momentum towards that thing? And this, of course, does not need to be related to physical attributes of your desired personal brand. This could be related to a date that you decide to really make moves on adopting a new habit that you want to have, or you start to actually work on that hobby that you want to have in your desired future self. So pinpoint what that thing might be and the time that you want to start to make those moves. But having said all of that, my tip number 5 is to stagger your identity shift for sustainability. Usually surface level changes are things that we can move on really quickly. That's where those overnight makeovers, transformations can happen. But real change usually takes time for us to be able to develop, for us to be able to truly start to believe that we are actually that person, to actually have the thoughts that align with those actions and those behaviors, to overcome that imposter syndrome and actually step into that being who we actually are. So when it comes to the reinvention that you want for yourself or your identity shift, don't feel like you have to do everything all at once. Think about how you might stagger that identity shift. For example, you might decide that there is a new habit, hobby, or skill that you want to be able to work on, and you really focus your attention on that thing for 3 months, 6 months, maybe even a year before you consider what the other habits, hobbies, and skills are that you want to add to your repertoire. You start to master one thing before you move on to the next thing. Or you could, if they are more little things, you could start to every month or every 12 weeks, for example, start to focus on what that new thing is that you can add. So it becomes a more sustainable pathway to your desired identity shift instead of having to just wake up one day as this totally new person. Those Cinderella makeover moments can be exciting because they signal to you or the world that there is some sort of change that is happening, but they aren't always necessarily lasting. Cinderella's carriage transformed back into a pumpkin, but that didn't actually matter. What mattered was the person that she had become in her life. It mattered that she was always that person that was going to win over hearts and minds because she had that personality to match, and that is often something that we develop over time. She just needed that opportunity to be able to overcome some of the limiting beliefs that she might have had around her potential. If you're thinking about rebranding and reinventing yourself, then check out my previous episode on this topic. Thanks so much, and I'll see you in the next episode.